Greetings, Marsh here, and welcome to episode 252 of my modded Factorio playthrough. In this episode, we are going to plan for all of the ingot setups. Enjoy! Well, the ore is looking nice and colorful here, so the system should run pretty well on its own now. And with that, we have all of the components of the ore sorting taken care of. And as a quick overview, to make plates, there's essentially 3 steps. One is the ore sorting step, where you start with the various angels ores, you process them, and you sort them into ores. That's kind of the hard part, but that's behind us now because we've got tier 3 there. But there's 2 other steps, and they're kind of kept separate from each other because they're not really the same. So the second step is making ingots, and there's a couple of processing stages that go into it, and that's what we need to work on next. And then the final stage is taking those ingots and turning them into plates or coils or whatever. And the reason why they're separate steps is because you see, like, for example, copper goes into all these different alloys. So if it was just a direct insertion or machine to machine, we would kind of lose out on this ability to do all of these alloys here. We need to rebuild this in a priority logic sort of way, pretty much exactly the same that this stuff was set up with storage warehouses, and only have the minimum number of belts on the bus like this. But those are the 3 steps, and we already talked about the smelting too. But for now, let's just focus on the ingots. And we kind of need to determine how big the setup's going to be, and because some of these setups will use some of the same resources, we should probably calculate them all and then figure out from there. Because some of this pellet processing, we have all these new methods here. But for example, we have some cathode and anode methods now that require sulfuric acid. So if we calculate everything with helmod, we'll have an idea of the input requirements as far as other resources that aren't available here, and then we can make sure that the factory is ready to handle all of that. Like, for example, before we were using the coke and carbon. So we kind of want to calculate everything to figure out how that goes. And we also need to figure out how many ingots we need to create. I covered it in a previous episode, but now that we have access to pellet processing, it basically doubles the efficiency of our ores. So, for example, if we had 3 belts of iron and turned it into pellets, we would get 6 belts of ingots on the other side. So we're certainly going to have higher production, but we also need to figure out how many resources we want to make. So for all of the resources that we make directly, like with tin here, it's 2 whole lines making 2 red belts. So in other words, 60 per second. So for example, that tin has 2 belts going out and 2 belts going in, which means that under normal circumstances, the full factory's output can be supplied by just these machines here. And tin is created as a byproduct in other methods, like with the cupric mixture here, and that will make it so this doesn't have to run as much. But ultimately, pretty much every method we have could produce at least 2 belts of output. If there's a direct processing method, like for example with manganese, it's not directly produced, it's a byproduct, so it doesn't really work that way. And certainly, any of the resources we're creating through sorting are nowhere close to that kind of output. I think we calculated before where it was like 4 per second or 8 per second, something like that. Not very much. But we want to plan for the future. And, you know, because we have those pellet processing, a lot of these methods where it's 2 belts going out will turn into 4. But it's also possible that if we need more than 2 belts, that the factory can produce that by having the lesser desired methods fire up. So we can burst for more than this, but we can't maintain it. The only thing we can maintain is the 2 belts right here. And as far as these resources go, we've been pretty good on most of this stuff that the factory's kept up pretty well. But iron and copper in particular, it has fallen behind before. It catches up eventually, but the problem with iron is so much of it has to go into steel that if you get a steel request and an iron request at the same time, it just nukes the factory. Or at least your output of iron. Or if we need Invar, it nukes steel. So we've definitely fallen behind on iron before, so I think it would be okay to increase that output. And also copper, you can kind of tell, it's not so much that we need a lot of copper, but it goes into so many things that when trains come in, that it just nukes copper because of all the different things that copper is a part of. So I think copper and iron could be buffed up. I think the other methods, now these go into a lot of things even though only 2 belts are going in, but the other methods seem like they've held up pretty well. We have been perpetually short on silver, but that's just because we have these 2 machines making it, and we never upgraded this for our 2 belts of copper with using catalysts, and it just hasn't really been relevant, but we certainly want to do that. So let's calculate how much we need for each of these different types. Well, let's get started on something new, and we'll just put absolutely everything in here, and we'll see what we get. Start with iron, and we have our 3 tiers of it, so we want to do the best tier with the iron pellets, and we need a certain output number. Let's just double check what we're making now. So 126 or 120 was the intent there. We'll just say the same thing for now, and we'll certainly change it. And I don't think productivity modules go into any of these machines here because they're intermediates. But we have our inputs. The blast furnaces use fuel, and since it also needs coke for the recipe, we might as well have coke be the fuel that it uses, just to make that easier. We need to make the pellets, which go in the pellet press, and then the processed iron from the ore processors, and then there we go. There's our 60 in, and we'll have a limestone requirement, but we'll probably have a lot of random products we'll need to make off to the side and pipe in here. We'll just have to see how it fits. So, what kind of output should we plan on for iron? Well, we could certainly do what we're doing now without much effort, but remember, we're also going to have access to manganese, and of the 4 things that it goes into, probably titanium and steel are the priorities. Titanium just because we can't make very much of it right now, and steel just because it takes a whole bunch of iron, and using manganese will cut it down. Then we have aluminum and iron here as well. But since we can't easily make manganese, this might have an effect on our choices. If you look at the manganese ore, it basically only comes from the ferrous dust sorting types and the mineral sludge. And we decided against processing this one right now because it would have created chrome, and we can't do anything with chrome right now. So if you look at the crushed ferrous mixture, this is the best way of making manganese. So for every unit of iron that it creates, it will also create a unit of manganese. Before, we were using all of that manganese just to go into iron, but now since we have other uses for manganese, this isn't the worst way of making iron because it would create all that extra manganese which could go into other processes. And then there's the powder and the dust. And these are actually pretty good methods too, because they both create a nickel and the dust creates a cobalt. And if we go to our nickel ingots, one thing that we unlocked with our next tier here is using nickel in iron or steel. It also requires cobalt, so that's kind of bad, but nonetheless, it's something we can do with it. So we're starting to get places that we can dump nickel, which is nice. Say like when we get the next tier of titanium, we could dump it into that, which would really be nice. So basically, I don't think that 1 extra nickel that comes out of these sorting methods are really that bad. So I think that we can include all of these ferrous sorting types as part of our regular iron output, just to create a bunch of manganese. And if it creates too much manganese, well, we can use that manganese to go into the iron, so we don't need to do as much of this sorting. So it kind of goes into itself. And this will be a great way of generating tons of manganese, which can be used for essentially non-iron processes. So how much would we have access to? Well, we can check each one of our lines here. So that would be 15. And then this one right here would be another 15. And finally, over here, let's just say that's another 15 or so. So we could add in another 45 iron fairly easily without having to go down the list of the worse and worse processing methods. So we have the 45 and we have the 60 here. And let's just make the numbers nice and easy and say, let's just add another 15 from other methods. So we would have a total of 120 input ore, which would be 4 belts here. We can switch this to input and say 120. And that increases output to 240. Or 8 belts of iron ingots. That's quite a lot. Of course, we could use cobalt to make those setups smaller. We're going to need all this space to make like a for realsies ore bus, or an ingot bus in this case, I guess, because of the outputs that we're going to be doing. But it's not quite as bad because a lot of the outputs just going to be going to the side like this to make iron. Some of these machines might have to move around to give us more space here, but that's okay. They probably will squish down with speed modules or whatever. I'm thinking we just kind of put them in the same spot they are now, because there's already a road here and there's already belts and everything. But that gives us our number where we have our output, and then we need our limestone and our coke. I'm probably going to need to update all of our carbon processing methods, because I don't think we're going to be able to keep up with this. But anyway, that's that calculation. So now the question is, can we do the same thing with copper? I'm thinking probably, because the copper mixtures are a similar recipe, but one disadvantage to them is that it's going to create a lot of tin. And I don't know if that is something that we can dump quite as easily. Bronze, brass, solder, gunmetal. And that titanium, which we can't do. So yeah, tin's actually going to be a hard thing to get rid of. Luckily, we're doing fine with it right now. We're at about 18,000. That's probably the set point, or pretty close to it, yeah. So we're not doing too bad on it, but I don't know if I want to be just creating gobs and gobs of it, because it's not something we can dump quite as easily as manganese. But at the same time, I have felt that we have been quite short on copper from time to time. When we're not short, everything's fine, but yeah, I'm thinking for now, just to have parity with iron, we'll do the same thing. I'm kind of worried about having a bit of a tin overload, but I mean, when you look at all of our resources, tin is one of the lower ones, so maybe we won't be overloaded on it. So we'll grab our copper ingots, the 3rd tier, and because we already know the output is 240 with this one, we can just say 240 here. Wow, that is a lot of acid. 600 per second. Good thing we're checking this. Come in here, let's see, it's asking for coal, but probably the best thing the factory has for fuel right now is the wood bricks. So we'll make that the default. And we'll need oxygen, but that's easy enough to create. We'll just go down the list there and create all the machines. And one thing we kind of want to check here is just how big everything's going to be, because we get our 1 speed module in here. Let's see, no module slots for the pellet press. That's kind of painful. Do the other ones get module slots? I guess they do, just not the 1st tier. Well, that's a little rough. I'm gonna have to have 40 of them. And speed modules there. What would this setup look like as far as size? Because we want to make sure it at least fits in the same spot here. Well, right now we have 40 of the ore processors, and we would only need to have 20. And then how big are the pellet presses? Same size. So that helps us a little bit. That we would need basically this many pellet presses. And then another 50% on top of that to kind of come up to here. And as far as these, we would only need about 8 of them. And we have 14. So, yeah, I think it would mostly fit in the same spot. It might end up being bigger with some of these other setups having more stages. But another thing that could get smaller are these right here. Just for calculation here, let's take it a step further. And let's say our goal was the sheet coils. One thing that's also interesting to note is the speed gets way faster when you use coolant, because the crafting time is 4 seconds to give you 2 sheet coils. But with the tier 2, it's 2 seconds to give you 4 sheet coils. So the machines are going to be a lot more dense. But there's our 240 inputs. These would get a speed module. And these would get 2 of them. So right now our setup has 60 of them, and it would only need to have 12. And then down here we have 42, and we would only need 14. So yeah, we could certainly leave some space for expansion here, but I think that these things could be made way smaller. So I think it would be okay if these had to extend up into our ingot bus a little bit here. We would just place the bus wherever it goes and then go from there. And there's definitely some space in here if we need to smash it in there a bit. I don't think we do, but it's good to know that it's there. Okay, we'll get rid of that for now. So we have our two setups with our inputs and outputs. We'll worry about all this stuff later when we have everything added together. But let's do another one, making the tin ingots this time. And as far as output here, I don't think we've really been too short. So I don't know if we really want to expand production right now, because we have an input of 60. That would give us our 120, which is still quite a lot of output. So I'm thinking we can probably stick with 2 belts for most of the other resources. And this one can be switched over to the carbon because it needs that as an input, and that takes care of tin. Let's do lead now, and we can just type in the 120. We've got some steps to do. The anode, and then the pellets, and the processed. This machine requires fuel, so we'll switch this over to the coke, which is what it's running on. So that's one less input. And there's also this acid, which is from silicon and hydrofluoric acid. So that's something that we could add in later here. And we'll have some slag and other things to push back down, but there's that. So we've also got the manganese we need to do here. So we'll do the manganese cathodes. And as far as output, well, this first one makes 15. The second makes 10. And the last one makes 8. We probably want to have some burst capacity to it, but we don't have much. Let's switch it to the input. So we have the cathodes. Then we need the manganese oxide. Then the pellets. And then the processed. So we could do 30, but that would end up not being very much. I wonder, maybe we should do 45, because that'll be slightly higher than our output, so we have some burst capacity. Since it is a byproduct, so it's not like we need to process it in real time. And that'll give us our 3 belts of output. It also creates the iron hydroxide, which can just be turned back into iron, so it's a circular thing here. So that's a lot of sulfuric acid, that's a lot of natural gas, so definitely these numbers are getting bigger. But yeah, we will have this iron hydroxide, which can be turned back into iron ingots, with some addition of coke. And now we have good inputs and good outputs. Let's go down nickel. It doesn't have pellet processing available, so we'll just have our 60 input and require some acid, and I'm pretty sure we're basically already doing that process. So this really shouldn't change anything. No. Probably won't change it for silicon either. So we'll have our 60, making the 90, and hydrogen chloride gas. But that'll be made nearby. Getting lots of stuff on our list here. So we need aluminum, zinc, and silver. Aluminum isn't really any different. It's basically the same as we're doing it before. We make the ingots from the alumina, which is made from processed, and back to the ore. And then 60. Looks like some of the tiers of machines are wrong here. It's one thing we definitely want to check when doing all this, is make sure we're using all of the correct machines. Switch this to carbon. Switch this one to carbon. So that is the aluminum. They're kind of a little out of order here, so we might fix that later. But we definitely don't have any silver or zinc processing going on here, which will be nice to do. Silver needs silver nitrate, which requires the nitric acid, and then the process over. We'll do 60, and that seems pretty good. Zinc needs carbon and oxygen. Otherwise, it's pretty straightforward. That sulfur dioxide gas can be processed later. Although this might be an example, since so many other methods use sulfuric acid, it might make sense just to process it here and not have to ship it all the way down to acid processing and then all the way back up here. But we can worry about that in a bit once we have an idea of all of the resources. So that's that, and then now we're at our new resources. We're not going to worry about the uranium processing for now, since we're going to have very little of it. But we do want to do the others. So the titanium ingot comes from the sponge, which comes from the acid. And then we need to decide how big to make it. Well, probably want to size it for the future. And the future would be 60. Even though it could not keep this up in any way right now. It will later. Requires the chlorine gas. Otherwise looking good. Then we have the cobalt, which is just the one step. We'll also do 60. Switch it over to carbon for one less item on the list. And gold, which is also very straightforward. We'll make it full size and worry about it later. And then we have a lot of stuff on here. I want to make sure we've got everything. I don't think we have the steels in there yet. But that's just iron and oxygen gas. To make it into the liquid steel, it would have the manganese and other things added to it. But I think those are otherwise our resources, so certainly looking at what we've done up here, it doesn't look like we're skipping anything other than the steel here. But I don't know if we really need to put it in there. Because, well, it does require oxygen gas. That would be nice to know how much that would be. So we'll do one more here. We'll say steel. And let's say our output is 30. Because that would require 120, which is like half of our output. And that would be 300 oxygen gas. Okay. Well, if everything is good here, we should have a sensible output, which is all of the ingots and some of these extra gases. And sensible inputs, which should basically be ores and fuels and acids. And that seems to be the case. Certainly some of these numbers are quite big. We're going to need to have a lot of fuel coming in here. Other numbers luckily aren't too bad, like sodium hydroxide. The acids are kind of bad, like that's really close to the maximum. But now let's go through here and try to calculate it for logistics. So in other words, we want to look at anything that would make sense to process it here rather than have it on a pipe from like way across the factory. So one big one is oxygen. I don't think I ever upgraded this. One thing I was thinking of is doing the oxygen processing locally here, and I guess it never really became a problem, so I never got around to doing it. But instead of sending oxygen from all the way across the factory down here at this oxygen generator here, we should probably make it locally. And I kind of want to step away from electrolyzing water to make oxygen. This is certainly creating free fuel, and it's creating free slag, and also free mineralized water. So there's a lot of advantages to it, but the problem we ran into before is just scale. That when it gets this big, it's just a problem with pipes. And I think I'm actually standing pretty close, so we can just go over there and look at it. That because the flow rates are so high for all of these liquids that are being moved around, you have to have like all these different pipes. Yeah, you can kind of see how all these separate hydro plants and separated pipes, and even look at the offshore pumps. Like how many offshore pumps were required to do this. Like that's a lot. And then you have to have all of these burners to get rid of all of the hydrogen, which they're going crazy right now. So I kind of want to step away from doing it in this method. It certainly creates hydrogen, which is useful, but I think I would rather do the electrolyzing for the hydrogen, not for the oxygen. And part of the reason why I did it that way is because I just don't like wasting things, and this is a good way of not wasting anything, where the other method of making oxygen involves having a bunch of nitrogen left over, but really, nitrogen isn't the worst thing in the world just to vent. I mean, that's mostly what the air is already, so it's not that big a deal. But I think I'd rather just waste the nitrogen than going through this level of effort to not waste any resources. So now that we know that, we can produce our oxygen locally, because we need so much of it. But we also want to look at any other outputs that we would want to process. The carbon dioxide would actually stay into the system and go where it needs to go, and same with the hydrogen gas. But what about the sulfur dioxide gas here? And that's coming from the lead. Well, unfortunately, because of the way it's done, we have to kind of come out here and do it separately. But because we need so much sulfuric acid, why send all that up here when we're going to have some gas right here? So why not turn that gas into acid? So we'll set it based on our input that we have. And it requires a little bit of purified water, that's no big deal. Can probably just do the calculation right here. Although it might not like that, so we'll just back it out again. It looks like we're also getting some sulfur dioxide gas from zinc. So you add those two together and some water, and now we are creating 275 sulfuric acid, which is cutting down the amount of acid that actually has to be shipped up here, which is good. So that's it for outputs. We do have a little bit of hydrogen, but let's take a look at some of this other stuff and see what we need to do. We need to make hydrogen chloride gas, but that's actually hydrogen positive, so that will create its own hydrogen as well, so that's not going to do anything about what we have here. The natural gas will probably have to be shipped in. That's quite a bit, so we almost might need to have a train for that, unless there's some oil mines nearby. There might be. I kind of remember kind of building over a few up here somewhere. There we go. Yep. Can't really see it. Guess we're out of power here. But we got one right there. At least this one isn't being covered up. So actually, yeah, we could get the gas over here relatively easily. So we wouldn't need a train or anything for that. So that's nice. Limestone can be made locally. The fuels will have to be shipped in. Sodium hydroxide, that's kind of already what we're shipping in, so there's nothing different there. The nitric acid will be shipped in. Although we do need chlorine gas, so now that we know that, it might actually be worth figuring some stuff out here, because chlorine isn't something that we ship normally, and it is easy enough to create by just electrolyzing saline water. So see, chlorine gas is required for the titanium. We have our various methods, and actually it's interesting, one thing we can do is separation of hydrogen chloride. That's a interesting way of doing it, because we're not shipping chlorine in a pipe right now, but we are shipping hydrogen chloride, so we can strip the chlorine from it and just like burn the hydrogen, I guess. But that seems kind of wasteful, especially if we're not going to be generating that much hydrogen in the future. But doing it from saline water is probably a good idea, because it will create the sodium hydroxide. And our factory just has a general excess of saline water anyway. So we'll do it that way then. We need to make sure it's set up to the right thing. So we'll unlink it, make that 0. And then it's 300, which I believe that was the number that we needed. So now we have even more hydrogen gas, and that's probably something we'd want to burn on site because of how much it is. Then there's the hexafluorosilicic acid, which is an ingredient in the lead here, made from the silicon and hydrofluoric acid. And that's actually a lot of silicon, 15, but otherwise it would get up there. Let's see, we would need to make a little bit of purified water, and that would reduce the saline water requirement, so we might as well. So purified water. Actually, one funny thing is that we will actually have the steam on hand from the cooling towers from the coolant, which would give us our access to purified water if we wanted to cool it down. But since we are going to need saline water here, there actually won't be any byproducts of just doing it the normal way. So we'll unlink it, hit saline to 0, because we want to make the purified water. And there it seems to work. Now just regular water's on there, reduce the saline water by a little bit. We got our ores. A lot of this stuff will be easy to make, and it will have places to go. So now I think kind of the big question is the fuel. Now, the wood bricks, for the few situations that we're using them, we need very little of it. But actually this fuel requirement will change with modules. Because when you use speed modules, energy consumption goes up, but not as much as speed does. So it actually consumes less fuel. So you see here, we need 1.34 a second of coke for the fuel for the blast furnace. Well, without it, it's 2. So by putting the speed modules in there, it's kind of weird how it moved to the side. By putting the speed modules in, it reduces the fuel requirements. So now we probably need to go through here and put the necessary speed modules in all of the machines, which is a little annoying. I don't know if there's a faster way of going through here, but it also only takes a few moments, so these higher tiers of modules are definitely coming in handy, making all this stuff smaller. And I guess since we're here, we'll probably want to put the speed modules in all of the relevant machines, because otherwise I'll totally forget to do it. It's nice seeing these machines drop down to less than 1. And this one's already less than 1, so I guess efficiency and pollution. Okay. All the machines have modules now. So the wood bricks will certainly not be a problem. It's just the coke and the carbon. However, upgrading those setups is going to be on the next episode. Thanks for watching, and I will see you later.